So I mentioned this topic before, this concept of checking your instruments. It's something that I read in a book, I believe, called Difficult Conversations. But the idea was fighter pilots, when they're flying in jets and the like, because of the speed at which they're flying, the conditions at which they're flying, visibility, etc., it's almost impossible for them to completely trust their eyesight to navigate themselves around where they're going. So there's all sorts of instruments built into the jet to help them do that, to determine their altitude and their distance from mountains or enemy pilots, whatever. And the idea is you need that, right? If you're going to survive the flight, you need these instruments because you can't just trust in your own eyes. And the parallel goes back to our own brains and the way that we think. So if you're making a decision, if you're forming an opinion, if you're having a discussion with somebody and you're trying to make sure you're being logical and rational, the idea is just like the fighter pilot can't trust their eyes, you can't always trust your brain. So you need some external input or instruments, if you will, to help check and make sure that you're doing that effectively. And I'm thinking about that topic of late. There was something that happened recently in the news that I won't get fully into the kind of back and forth and the pros and cons or who was right or who was wrong. But in the news in New York, at least recently, was that Governor Cuomo made a statement that he wants to start, or at least part of his press conference, he spoke about that he wants to maybe work with the Gates Foundation to start to think about ways to reimagine New York schools, right? Given that everything's being done virtually with the coronavirus. His question was, with all the technology we have, why do we need all these buildings? Why do we need a bunch of kids sitting in front of one teacher and being taught kind of the traditional way? Which I'll say up front, anytime you're asking a question and challenging something and thinking about, is there a way to be better? That's typically a good thing. Now, for various reasons, there's been a lot of debates and arguments about this from teachers and teachers' unions and just people's opinions on it. So again, I'll put those aside. But one of the critiques that came up that I've heard constantly is, why is he even talking about this right now? Why does he feel the need to dip his nose, if you will, into the education system at this point? We're still dealing with the coronavirus. He's not an educator. I get it. He's a politician, but why is he overstepping? Is the concern some people had. And again, let's put that aside if he actually is overstepping or not. But it made me start thinking about the times in which you need your instruments the most. And one of those times is when you're in a position of power. When you're in a position of power, there's the phrase, right? Absolute power corrupts absolutely. The idea being, once you get put in that position, the natural checks you have on yourself and the way you think start to be diminished. And there's probably various reasons for that, right? You start to get validation because you've accumulated this power. You have a lot of control. People have to listen to you. So it starts to give you an inflated sense of self and your inflated sense of your intellect and your logic. And you start to drop the barriers, right? It's the same concept as the certainty we always talk about. Power is just another way to ascertain that certainty. And once you have that, however you get it, whatever form it comes in, you start to think, I don't need to question or challenge my thinking as much. And there's a movie that does a really good job of, actually it's not a movie, it's a psychology experiment that was made into a movie called the Stanford Prison Experiment, which does a really nice job of kind of illustrating this point of how power starts to shift the way you think. If you haven't seen it, I'd recommend watching it. But the basic premise is they took, don't quote me on the specifics here, but they took something like 20 Stanford college students at random that all, in theory, were the same types of students. They tried to get a random mix. And they made 10 of them prison guards and they made 10 of them prisoners in this kind of made up scenario experiment. And very quickly within the experiment, those that were chosen, again at random, to be the prison guards, so in put in a position of power, started to abuse that power, started to, in some cases, torture the prisoners or just treat them really poorly, and they started feeling this inflated sense of self and power and what they were. And it was a totally made up scenario. Everybody knew that. Everybody was in their right mind at the onset of it. But that power that they were given just changed them. So again, I say all this because I think when in a position of power, that's the time in which you really need to be extra on checking yourself. And beyond just checking yourself, you need some instruments to really help you check. And as it is with the fighter pilot with their eyes, it comes down to a matter of trust. And probably my blanket statement is, and I think most people that think deeply about this would agree, is you should never fully trust your brain. there's just too many biases. There's too many things that impact the way we think. There's too many holes in logic that we can't even see, and blind spots. If you ever believe like you have it all figured out, right? It's you don't, and that's when you'll get into trouble, right? I've talked before about levels to thinking in this way. As you get to those higher levels, you don't get more certainty. You don't get more confidence in your ability. If anything, you start to question more and challenge more. So people that don't do that, that's where they run into trouble. And again, when put in a position of power, it's a natural situation for you to do that. So again, this concept of checking the instruments becomes super important to account for the fact that you can't trust your own mind. The question becomes, what are the right instruments to check? Often one of the key ones that pops up is other people, right? If you can have other people that you trust that can help challenge you and push you in some way that you'll receive it and digest it and take it and know like, hey, if this person's saying it, it means something. That's probably one of the most impactful ways. And a simple example of this, somewhat unrelated but kind of related, is you hear this with celebrities all the time. When they get very popular, very famous, celebrities that typically are a little bit more, have the head on their shoulders, try and keep people around them to keep them grounded. That's just another form of an instrument to keep them from getting, too big for their britches and feeling, again, that inflated sense of self. So having somebody to be there to check you, that can give that objective view is really important. Now, it has to be the right person, right? Because it's very easy when you're in a position of power to have people that are just yes men or yes women, and that's all that does is help validate your power and your confidence, and that could go totally awry. So it has obviously have to pick those people wisely. One of the other things I've started thinking about recently from another book that I'm reading, which name slips my mind right now, but it's this concept that's called a 20-mile march. And the idea is that successful companies, the way that they get successful is they go on this 20-mile march, right? It's a very kind of plodding, deliberate, slow and steady march towards whatever objective they have. And what I find most applicable to this scenario is the first step in that march is to very clearly, very definitively identify your objectives and what you're trying to achieve, whether that be revenue growth or customer satisfaction or whatever the metric is for those companies. But the idea is you lay that out up front when you're thinking very rationally, when everything's very calm, and you've had the time and you've had the right input to say, hey, these are the things that are most important to me. And why I think that's so important and why it acts as a bit of an instrument is once you start then on that march and things start to happen, right? Sticking with the scenario of a march, right? You get a storm or you sprain your ankle or all these things start to happen that can start to divert you from that march. You kind of are grounded in your plan, your path, what matters, what's important, and it helps keep you on track and it helps you kind of not get sidetracked when things might go wrong or when things get stressful or whatever it might be. And I think it's a really good, useful tool to use in these scenarios as well. For people in power, for anybody, but speaking of people in power, let's just take Governor Cuomo in this case. Again, not passing a judgment on if he's right or wrong, but just in the scenario, something that could have been done at the onset of this crisis is to say, hey, let me think about what the next 3, 6 months, 12 months are going to look like and what my role is going to be in this. And let me jot down and document what I think my most important job is to do here, the things that could go wrong, the things I want to make sure I stay true to, what my values are in this, so that as the days go by and as circumstances start to change, whether that be, catastrophe hits and things get worse, things get better, or in his case, which is interesting, is there's a bit of celebrity that's picked up with him. He's kind of nationally televised. He's gotten a lot of credit for some of the work he's done and the way he's handled this, rightfully so, in many cases. Those things can start to build that ego and that sense of certainty and confidence in yourself. As that starts to happen, as you start to think like, hey, I'm really good at this. I'm doing a great job. Let me start to expand what I'm thinking and what I'm doing and the impact I could have. You have that document, if you will, and those objectives laid out front, your value system to keep you focused, to keep you on track. And I think if you pair that with the other, the external, the people that are around you that help you do that, it gives you a very good chance of staying on the path you want to stay on, staying rational, staying logical, and staying true to what you really want to do and what you believe, how you could add most value.